Right, this is basically the lecture on how to beat a bunch of hippie nonsense. You don't have any patience for it, you shouldn't either. A lot of people like to get the idea that they've read a book or part of a book and then they know everything about Heidegger or whatever, and it's not the case. So, yeah, there's some basic areas that we're going to cover. So we can just go ahead and start. So as far as like the K is concerned, like you don't really have to. There's like one win condition, and the win condition for every critique is always the same, and it's you have to prove that it's bad. And it's so basic, and it's like for some reason people still get confused. And the way that you prove something is bad is very rarely with any amount of defense. Like people make a lot of assumptions about the value of defense in a K debate. Typically, it's fine in like counterclaim politics, whatever. K debate, though, you're all about bringing the fight straight to their dumb hippie nonsense. So, and there's many different ways that you can do that. The second thing is the basic types of the K. There's, I think, in my mind at least, and I think Smitty agrees, there are three basic types. There's language. So there are critiques based on word choice or things that you've said or things that your authors have said or the phrasing or the grammar, anything that has to do with that. The second would be project. Projects are distinct in that they typically involve some amount of out-of-round work, something that the team has been doing or consistently runs for an entire tournament as like a personal advocacy. And the third would be ideology. And these are like your big stick Ks. These are things like CAP, DIA, borders, FEMIR. If any of these words don't make sense to you, by all means, shout at me. You can scream at us at any time. I'm happy to answer questions the whole time.
I guess one thing I would add to that is those are not mutually exclusive, neat siloed categories. I mean, certainly somebody's linguistic choice. I mean, the whole point of a language K, for instance, is that somebody's linguistic choices probably have certain historical and ideological baggage that is problematic, and that you can't separate out those linguistic choices with sort of ideological structures that language is embedded into. So these aren't like neat, distinct categories, and there's not a lot of really strategic import in these categories. They're just sort of useful heuristics for how to think about different sorts of Ks, but they're really, they're sort of arbitrary and contingent terms. They don't really mean a whole lot. They're just maybe a useful way of thinking, but if you don't find it useful.
Yeah, then obviously disregard. So, most Ks, especially nowadays, start with an absurd amount of framework. And framework really bothers the both of us. Framework is, in our mind, a colossal waste of time. Typically, framework is used exclusively to conclude the 1AC. We think that's pretty jankety for a few reasons. Obviously, they shouldn't preclude your speech act. You're tied as the affirmative to the resolution, so them precluding you from 28 minutes worth of, or 27 minutes, like, prep plus 1AC, that's not all right. So framework in general is where a lot of apps go, a lot of the MGs go, and they say, this is where we're going to make our stand. Because if we can beat down framework, then obviously we have now access to our 1AC. That's not the case. You always have the ability to leverage your 1AC against the critique, and that should be the story that is consistent from the very beginning in the MG all the way through to the PMR, because that's something that's going to resonate with the judges. They're hearing the 1AC basically 3 times now, and it's very important that the points that you make in the MG are very specific to where that goes. So Smitty, Smitty is a lot better at this than I am in leveraging 1AC. He was also in the MG. So.
Yeah, so I'll talk about, I think before we talk about framework as such, I think it's useful to talk about the role of the 1AC in K debate. Because a lot of people, I think that the primary mistake that most affirmers make in K debates is that they start the K debate in the MG. And that is a mistake because, you've given away possibly your biggest asset in the debate, which is the 1AC. The 1AC is where you start the debate against the K. It's where you start thinking about how to beat the K, and it's how you start thinking about how to leverage your offense about the K and your narrative of why you win on the K. So let's talk a little bit about the 1AC, and then talk about framework, because I think that a lot of the points that we want to make about framework debates make more sense after we've talked about the role of the 1AC in a K debate. So, fundamentally, at least in my mind, about 90% of K debates that I judge usually come down to either a question of sort of competing worldviews or competing root cause claims. And it is usually really good if you can use your 1AC to try to get out in front of the negatives, root cause claim, or their sort of narrative of why the problems with the 1AC happen. You know, to take the CAP case, for instance, because it's probably the most common case that people run, right? The CAP case says that all of the things that you've identified in the 1AC you cannot solve for because you reify and reaffirm this overarching structure of capitalist, exchange and capitalist production, and that is sort of the root cause of the harms that you've identified in the 1AC, which means that your app doesn't solve, in fact, it's probably worse. And what you need to do is to use your 1AC as a tool to say either that capitalism writ large is not the root cause, or that even if capitalism may be the root cause in some very broad global sense, in the specific context of the 1AC, that capitalism with a capital C is not what causes these things. What causes these things are specific political or institutional problems that your 1AC has identified, that your 1AC has a specific method of solving. And that can give you leverage on literally every sheet of debate. It gives you leverage on the link debate, on the permutation debate, on the framework debate, etc.
The basic thesis is that no matter what they say in the critique, they're going to make the argument that whatever X is the root cause, you always need to have the argument that Y is the root cause every single time. Like if you don't have a competing root cause claim, then you have an uphill battle, certainly.
Sure. And again, when you're in prep time or when you're writing your 1AC before a tournament, you should always be thinking, what are the big Ks that people are going to be reading on this topic, and what does our 1AC do to help us leverage and get out in front of the K?
Yeah, and political participation, obviously we're using the political process, our voices matter, this is proof of the value of agency, things like that. Start thinking about the way that using the federal government is actually not just this monolithic concept, but it is many moving parts and many people that are involved sharing their dialogue and their discourse, and from that, positive change is effected, which the K obviously completely derives.
So I think that's right. So I think that there are
good, thanks. That worked out.
So I think that there are three basic strategies of how you can use the 1AC to sort of get out in front of the K. The first is that you can just read a K out of the app.
Yeah.
And that you can, you can say that policymaking is bad and that we shouldn't talk about what the USFG should do because it's an imaginary entity, it's not real, that we have no control over it. Instead, that we should use debate as a space for us to mobilize our social location to talk about problems that matter to us. Or something like that. And that is one approach. Of course, that's a good way to get out in front of the K, but it also makes you susceptible to people coming at you from the right and say,
or out-lefting you.
Or out-lefting you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can get out-lefted and you're just up shit creek.
Yeah, it's not good.
And there's not a whole lot that you can do. It's very hard if you've gone to the left in the 1AC to then pivot right in the MG.
Yeah.
Right, like you don't want to read a K app and then start reading policy making good in the MG. If you've done that, it means that something in your strategy is going grievously wrong.
Something bad has happened.
So, but you can, read a critique out of the app, and the nice thing about that is that you've sort of defined, and this is true always about the 1AC, is that you've defined the terms of engagement by reading your K out of the app, and so if you know your argument well enough, even if people come at you from the left or from the right, you should be able to just that's the one way. The second thing you can do, yeah, what's up?
I just wanted to know if you could comment somehow on topical KAFs.
I'm just kidding.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
So, second thing you can do is to read a topical plain text with a critical net benefit. This is probably one of our favorite strategies.
It also gives you a lot of leverage because when you're doing that, that means that you have the option to kick case and go for the the K advantage essentially. So you can spike out of a lot of the offense that they've wasted their time on, which is nice. It's always good to have a critical advantage.
We would do that. I also like reading the policy app with critical advantage, and then occasionally, if people try to come at us from the right, read policy add-ons in the 2AC. But, for instance, there was a topic at NPDA this year in doubles, which was something like the USFG should significantly restrict use of unpiloted aerial vehicles in domestic airspace. And so our app was basically, the resolution as our plain text, with an advantage about how police departments use drones as crime control devices against African Americans and Hispanics.
Yeah.
And we made arguments about why that was bad. Some of them were policy-ish arguments, some of them were sort of, spins on Wilderson type arguments. And I thought that was a way that we can make a lot of the very sort of critical race type arguments while still reading a policy affirmative and not losing on topicality. And not losing on T or not losing on framework are really, it's an underrated advantage to doing the policy affirmative with a critical net benefit. Because sometimes people will say, well, you should read a plan, or you should read a topical plan, or your plan isn't topical for X, Y, Z reason. And it's very hard to lose on an argument when your plan is like the res, or very close to the res. So, and then the last thing is obviously then you can read you can just read a straight up policy app, and then your approach against McKay is to say policy making is good, we should talk about real things that affect real people, and you just use that to leverage in the impact debate.
Word. So the next part of the K, if you're reading it, any normal K at least, would be the links. And it is going to be very difficult for a lot of people to avoid the pitfall, which is making a ton of defensive no-link arguments.
Hold on. So I'm going to let you get to this in like 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
So, sorry. So
I'm going to let you finish.
I have the best framework lecture of all time.
What is it?
That's the joke.
I don't get it.
Yo, I'm going to let you finish, but
I don't know.
I have the best. The Kanye reference.
I don't want to.
Anyway, so back to framework. The point about framework that I think we were trying to make earlier is that a lot of people read framework like, oh, you didn't read a fiated app, or you didn't read, your critique isn't, a fiated policy option, and that's bad, and you should lose because you did that, because the only fair way to debate is to debate about, what the USFG should do. And usually, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me or to Kyle or to many people to say that framework is an offensive reason that you should lose the debate. But framework does have an important purpose, which is to ensure that you can leverage the affirmative against the criticism.
So your goal on framework, your answers should be mostly specific. 1, to anything in the framework that is preclusive of the AF, and 2, anything that's spiky. So anything like theory spikes, anything that's got a voter on it. Those are basically the only 2 things you have to worry about on the framework. There's no reason to go into a round with a pre-prep like 20-point framework block. It's not going to do anything for you. What's going to do anything for you is giving yourself the bridge to the 1AC, which then you can use as a tool the entirety of the round.
Right. So for instance, if people say fiat is imaginary, which means that your app never happened, we can't leverage any arguments against the app. And yes, the answer is duh, but we should still have a discussion about what the app means, what our speech act or our representations from the 1AC is, and we can weigh those and compare those against the criticism, right? And that's the kind of framework argument you can make without saying the framework is an offensive reason that you should win the debate.
It might surprise a lot of K debaters to find out that we actually all know that fiat isn't real. Whoa.
I love it. And then, in certain cases, there are framework arguments that sort of interact with the substance of the debate, where, they will make, I think for instance, if any of you guys have debated against Nietzsche arguments, sometimes they will make their eternal recurrence arguments, or their, that genre of arguments, and then leverage those arguments in the block to say, well, your app can't do anything because the eternal recurrence means that, all of this being will, the beingness of your app will come again, and that means that your app can't solve, and...
Which is something that you can cross-apply the answers that you will be making later on in the flow to framework. So you can say, like, we'll get back to framework. You want to make the substantive answers elsewhere, so you're not doing the same work twice.
Sure, but my point is just that in certain circumstances, in order for you to, they will have arguments that they will use to preclude your app. They're not like framework arguments like fiat is imaginary or fiat isn't real, but they'll have arguments that are sort of substantive arguments that they use to preclude
It's
their
not
app.
real. Everything has changed.
So I'm just saying to keep your eyes out for that distinction. But yeah, fundamentally, the point of framework debates is just to make sure that you can weigh your app and leverage your app against the K, because if you can't do that, you're already way behind in the debate. And so the whole point of the framework debate is just making sure that you can use your app to win the debate.
All right, I think we've said that like 50 times, so.
Well, it was worth saying.
It bears repeating though, that's true. Okay, so links. This is really important. You are going to be very tempted to make a bunch of defensive no-link arguments because it's a good way to get words out and ink on paper. Unfortunately, in a critique debate, every no-link that you make guarantees that you will have now 3 arguments against that no-link. So really, in terms of ink on paper, you're at a 3-to-1 disadvantage because you're going to say no-link, we don't actually do that. And their first argument is going to be this is proof that what you're doing is functionally part of the critique. Second, this is just, like all of this is a new link argument. Why let them have access to their stupid generic argument about how this is always going to be a new link? Like they explained that in the critique already. You don't need to argue with that. Your point isn't that you don't not link. It's that you always just want turns. All that you want on the link level is offense. And you always want to show, one, this ties into the leveraging of the 1AC. You want to be able to tell them that app actually solves harms of the K, which you've presumably done already to some level in the framework debate. And you also want to say why what they do is like it's perpetuating the ills that it purports to solve, right? And you'll get more in depth on that on the alternative level, but at the link level you at least want that big T just so the judge knows like that's big to them. Like anytime a judge sees a T next to an argument, that has infinitely more credibility than some stupid NL. Like that, okay, no link, great defense. Like there's always going to be like a risk, although in the K world that's also a silly argument. So yeah, make sure on the link level that you always go heavy on offense. And if you have trouble with the critique, like if it's something that you don't really understand that well, if it's literature you haven't heard before, obviously don't feel afraid to ask the other team for like a brief synopsis. Like what is this going for and like what is your basic story? Like give me a sentence as to what that is. And you also always want to be asking for the alt text, like as soon as they start reading a K. That way you'll have the ability to plan for this moving forward. The next section that they've got impacts. And
Yeah.
Yo, you see?
On the link debate, so earlier at the advanced K lecture, he told us that links would be used as defensive for the app.
Yes.
So we should always be putting on the links page so that to preempt them using their conceded links as permanent.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to concede it. You just want offense.
Yeah.
So this is like kind of a funny question, but I've been told like by certain coaches that you don't want to label your link turns as turns, but just rather make the same argument, right? But so in your mind, you think it's better to have in the judge's mind that it's a turn to just have this symbol in front of it.
I think so.
Yeah, I think for me, like as a judge, like when a debater says turn, there's just this subconscious, I guess, feeling I have of credibility for the argument, right? Like I see the T and I go, oh, this is going to be a dope offensive argument that gives them some value. I think just saying it helps.
Matt Swanson.
Why hide your arguments? Like, if you know your argument's good too, you don't need to like shroud it. Cause
Yeah. no, good question. Yeah, impacts. Now, when you're first starting out and you're getting a lot of Ks, you are going to be excited by the idea of throwing offense on the impact by returning it. This is a very bad idea in a K debate because that will typically be proof of further link. Like if you impact turn a critique, you're opening up a huge bag of nightmares that you don't want no part of. Like
I
that's-
don't. I mean, there's some. So I think that you have to use your best judgment on this one.
I don't
right?
have good judgment, so I just don't do it.
But for instance, if they say you're racist and good, not a winning
showing.
argument.
Yeah, no patriarchy good arguments. Those aren't going to get you anywhere. Unless
But-
you're debating.
No,
or
that's
something.
But yeah, I mean, you should not say racism good, patriarchy good, West is best, things like that.
Cap good, however, that's totally fine. Obviously, capitalism is good for like a bajillion reasons. I mean, you like medicine and infrastructure and discourse and like not people just killing each other all the time. Hey, Blue?
Do you find, I mean, like, would you, where would you put arguments that are sort of like, so say like someone runs like specifically genocide or genocidal type arguments, right? Like, there are examples in which like there have been positives
To genocide?
No.
to outcomes afterwards.
I would never make the argument that like any amount of people dead is worth like whatever the good was. I guarantee you it doesn't, because like ultimately on the K they're probably going to be making like DEUM arguments anyway.
Right.
Like so,
I mean, the thing
You don't
is,
wanna bite into that even further.
is one of the classic genocide arguments made in the context of the K is they say that genocide is bad because it instrumentalizes people and it treats them as disposable. And saying, well, genocide's actually good because even though we killed all these people, you know, we got the good stuff out of it.
That's proof that they're disposable, right?
Yeah, but like,
Like when you think of them that
you
way.
could still win couldn't you win inevitability claims?
That's
and then,
important.
Yes.
That is very important.
Now, inevitability claims operate at a different level because they're not really offense, but they do make the K go away. Like, if you can win that, and this goes back actually to the root cause arguments, up on like framework at the link level that you're making. Because, yeah, if you're making the argument that like, well, this is inevitable because such and such is actually the root cause, this is gonna happen forever, they are going to obviously make the argument that the way that you do that, the fact that you say that is the logic that makes these things inevitable. Like the reason you saying that the impacts are going to happen forever just means that the K's impacts will continue to happen. But if you're willing to get into that fight, it's not the worst way out because it is a clean kill. Like if you can get inevitability, then you're good to go. What do you put there?
Just keep talking.
Oh, word. Yeah, so I think that we're good there. My bread and butter, and I think the most rich potential area for offense is always, always, always the alternative. Always the alternative. Because this is where they give you their stupid, hippie, like platform on how they're gonna save the world. And that's never true, because we've had a bajillion debate rounds where people have run some very interesting and important literature, and yet these ills are still happening, right? So the things that you wanna say on the alt first, you wanna identify and explain in detail, and it's worth spending the time as to why this actually perpetuates the harms of the critique worse. So for example, on a cap K, like they're gonna make the alternative, like our personal advocacy, like breaks down like capitalist logic and debate, blah, 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 blah. Your answer to that could be like, look man, like you're here as a student from a public or private university, afforded all of these privileges by capitalism, you have a unique role in that. You at no point identify your own role in the commodity market, like the system of exchange. And as a result, you making these like grandiose claims about how your advocacy is going to be the thing that problematizes all of capitalism is utter garbage and makes people have this hollow fake hope that we can resolve issues that way. When in fact, making those arguments just further instills a desire for the legitimacy of capitalism in general. So you always want to point out ways that the alt is just way worse than
So I want to go back to the point that Ashley was making in our little discussion about inevitability, because I think that we're going to talk more about inevitability claims as we talk about the alternative, the permutation debate, but I think that it's worth talking about them in the context of the link and the impact debate too. At the end of most critique debates, the two things will happen. That the affirmative will make the claim that the alternative does not solve all or part of the 1AC, and the negative will make the claim that the affirmative and or the permutation does not resolve one or more link arguments on the check. And usually that will be the comparison of whether the app solves all the K or vice versa, and then like what link arguments on both sides are and aren't being resolved. And the reason that ends up relating to inevitability questions is because it may be the case that the app doesn't resolve one of the link arguments that the neg has isolated. But if that link, if whatever impact they're trying to garner off that link argument is inevitable anyway, then there's no reason to do the alternative. The only impact to doing the alternative is inevitable, and that the alternative can't solve the app, right? And so I think that framing, when you talk about comparing link arguments or comparing the alternative versus the permutation of the plan, it is always important to keep in mind as just a framing question, do they resolve all your offense and do you resolve all their offense? And I think inevitability is a useful argument in that context because inevitability claims are ways to say that the offense that you are trying to claim is an advantage doing the alt only, or the offense that you're trying to claim is a reason to doing the permutation as opposed to only the alternative. That if those impacts are inevitable either way, then that is not an offensive reason to vote for one or the other.
So remember that when you're doing these comparisons, always be thinking about what link arguments are you resolving, whether the impact argument that you're trying to get off that link argument is inevitable, and we'll talk about this much more in the permutation, but also a question of whether permutation actually shields or resolve the link argument that the critique is going.
Yeah, since we're headed in that direction anyway, as far as perms go, this is like a really tricky subject. Perms are hard. Like, you need to be up on your theory. You need to do some research, probably outside of, even your own, like, team practices. Like, you have to look up resources. I would highly recommend checking out cross-x.com. It's like the high school policy forum, and it's got a lot of really good guides, like intro to like perm theory. Very, very important. Your basic perms, Smitty and I have a few different ideas of how they can function. The first and foremost perm that you'll always use against a K is do the plan and all non-competitive parts of the alternative. Very, very standard. That gets you out of actually having to like read the alternative into your perm and figure out what is and what isn't competitive.
I mean, the problem with
it
that,
absolves you from some work.
It does, but the problem then is that then the 2NC gets up and they say, these are all the competitive parts that your permutation doesn't resolve.
It's a lazy way out. It is not ideal. What is ideal, I like the perm, do the plan, and like, what is it, perm to the all? What was the one we were talking about?
Yeah, so we'll get to that later. I mean, but
we don't have
to talk more, we have less than half. We've gotten through all the topics on the board in less than half.
Oh, no, there's more, well, there's more that's not on the board. Anyway, whatever.
Anyway, but usually when people read the, do the alt and all non, or do the app and all non-competitive part of the alt, or do the app, or do the alternative and all other instances in the plan, usually that's made as part of the double bind argument, that either the link is, either the link is so weak that doing the alt in every other instance is sufficient to solve. You don't need to do it in the instance of the app, or that it's so strong that doing it all the time that you can't be able to resolve the link argument anyway, for some version of that argument. The problem with this argument, everybody makes this argument, and it's an easy argument to make. And the problem with it is that you're just going to get crushed by a good K debater all the time. So they're going to say, no, every link argument that we have made in this debate is a reason that in this instance it is important to do the criticism. It's important to do the alt. And just saying do it all the other times doesn't resolve any specific argument we made about why in the context of this issue, this debate, it's important to do the alt. Right? Especially because a lot of people now have started making the arguments about why it is bad to have political strategies that involve the idea that we can just postpone our agency and our responsibility into the future, and this sort of strategy of saying, well, we'll just kick this problem down the road, and rather than realize it's incumbent upon us to resolve this problem and to leverage our subject positions and our social locations in order to address whatever concern the K is talking about, that is a bad and bankrupt political strategy. So then you have both sort of two big problems of that permutation. One is that you don't resolve the link arguments, and also there's an independent disad because that methodology of just kicking it down the road and saying we'll deal with it in some other context is independently sort of depoliticizing and bankrupting bad.
Word. There's a very classic response on the alternative that you need to make, and I think that the way that a lot of people make it is way too flippy, and that it does you a whole lot of good if you spend some time on it, and that is the coalitions argument. Everyone should always have the argument somewhere on the alternative that the process of the critique fractures active and existing coalitions that are critical to the process of moving forward in this progressive direction. That's a good argument, and that's great to say, but you really want to flesh it out. Things that you want to show are like, what are these coalitions? Who are they? Where are they? You want to isolate and identify as specifically as possible so that you have some real world, like existing things that you can use against this nebulous ideology the critique represents. You really also, outside of just identifying who those coalitions are, you want to prove that this K is uniquely the thing, like this advocacy is the way that it breaks in half. Like, all of these coalitions become fractured, the groups split, and then the reason why that's bad, obviously, is because when groups split up, then your numbers go way down, you're a lot easier for the system that they've already identified as co-optive and bad, for that to crush you. So, what up, Lee?
Is the whole fracturing thing because it just represents a slightly different ideology that splits existing groups?
Yeah, well, I mean, so that goes back also to like the monolithic concept of like the federal government that the critique brings up. So at the point where the federal government, granted, is like, I'm not gonna argue that there are machine politics at play and that the industrial military complex is not real. Like, it is very much real. Like, that is a real thing. But that also, like, that's not the way that we have access to agency. So if you're making this critique argument about personal advocacy and why that's gonna be good for you to create this positive change, like, really all that means is that at some point, A, you're gonna get co-opted because someone's gonna find a way to make money off of it, or the government is going to find out that it is far more useful for them for you to be brought into the fold or what have you. Like, and that context changes based upon the critique that you're hitting, obviously. Like K versus like MIR.
Yeah.
Really different.
So I want to talk about this in the context of one set of arguments that comes up a lot, which are arguments about class and then arguments about identity politics. So a lot of times people will, especially affirmers, will make these sort of arguments either against cap arguments or race arguments or any sort of identity politics argument that says, you know, this issue is the issue, right? A lot of affirmers will start saying, no, we don't want to look at the issue. We want to look at the, our affirmative is key to looking at the intersection of different sorts of nodes of oppression. I guess the three big ones that people talk about are class, race, and gender. And so I think that as the affirmative, it's often useful to make these intersectionality good arguments, coalitions good arguments, incremental change good arguments, pragmatism good, Big Tent.
Yeah, intersectionality, for those of you who don't know, intersectionality is a really, really, really important argument that you need to have. Basically, anytime anyone in any case represents some monolithic ideological concept, they're going to be making a lot of assertions about who those people are that are involved with it. For example, like classic, like FemIR, for example, the classic response to that is like, well, this is not intersectional because this does not take into account the voices of women of color and people that are not on the mainstream of like third wave femme, for example. So it's like there are people that aren't Judith Butler whose voices are very much important and integral to the entire story of gender and the way that that is situated by the body politic. So like you need to definitely be making the claim that like, great, you've got this big voice and like you've got your soapbox, but you're totally ignoring all these other people, and by ignoring all of these other groups, you're basically rendering the whole point of the K moot. Like,
Sure.
Why even bother?
This argument goes both ways though, because on the one hand, you have lots of people who make the argument that that focusing on identity politics or a single sort of locus of identity or oppression is bad because that sort of fractures these coalitions, and because it fractures these coalitions, that it makes it easier for different parts of the movement that would otherwise be strong when combined to be co-opted and for the movement to fail. But a lot of negatives make the opposite claim as well, that they make the argument that focusing on intersections or focusing on other nodes of oppression is itself a divide and conquer strategy that's used to obscure the primacy of one of these nodes of oppression. So one argument that I've seen people make a lot more in the last few years is people reading, rather than read, before about 2011, 2012, most of the cap case that people read in partly were your standard, I don't want to say bad, but they were your standard sort of, hippy-dippy, a little abstract arguments about what,
Wrong.
I sort of grab bags different arguments about capitalism. And starting pretty recently, a bunch of teens have started reading orthodox Marxism when they're reading Cap Case. And the major reason that a lot of these teens, I remember having this discussion in Oregon a couple years ago, started reading orthodox Marxism because they want to get out in front of race and gender arguments by saying, no, your strategy of focusing on race and gender, your strategy of focusing on intersectionality is problematic because it all comes down to the relationship between individuals and the means of production. That's all it is. It's all about cap, right? And it's all about the way in which our location within the mode of capitalist production frames us and frames our political relation to the mode of production and to one another. And it is all about capitalism. And so they would use that argument to leverage against race arguments by saying you're talking about race is just a way that the bourgeois or the government tries to get you to not think about class consciousness, right? And that the only way that we can overcome capitalism is to create a broad proletarian class consciousness that focuses on the primacy of our identity as a member of the proletariat.
That can be summed up as like internet intersectionality is distracting. Like
Yes, I mean that.
functionally the thesis of that argument.
Yes, I mean that is the three-word summary. Correct. But I'm just saying that these arguments go both ways, and that certainly as a negative, if you're going to say identity politics is key, you need to be able to say not only why intersectionality or sort of a Big Tent coalition approach is bad, but also an argument about why the particular node of oppression that you've isolated is bad. Why, for instance, class is more important than race, or why race is more important than gender, or so on and so forth.
What are they too?
So what is an effective strategy to go about deploying these sort of intersectionality arguments on the app?
You have to pick.
Yeah.
You really you got a choice.
Well,
Like,
what do you find to be the most persuasive?
I think you make intersectionality arguments in general because I feel that it's far more persuasive to make arguments about losing out on voices. And I think that there are a lot more empirics on, for example, people that have been subject to genocide and like the voices that have been lost as a result of like cultural distinctions. And I think that the same argument you can leverage. I mean, you're basically bringing like the nuclear bomb of the debate world, which is like extinction and dehume. Well, dehume's stupid. Don't ever try.
Well, I mean,
but yeah, like you can reference that. You can reference extinction as.
I also think maybe more plausibly than that you could. But I think that, for instance, you can talk about like feminist and civil rights movements in the U.S. and make the argument that those movements sort of took off when they stopped being at odds with one another, and when moderate civil rights supporters and moderate feminists started actually lobbying Congress for change rather than standing on the sidelines and burning things and saying damn it white. But that was not an effective strategy of social change. But that when they started lobbying Congress and trying to work with policymakers, that was a way that they could get real material changes in the world.
That was also that was a big thing in the world of third wave feminism. Judith Butler in Gender Trouble started writing about. A lot of people thought what she was doing was co-opting like LGBTQI issues under the third wave femme moniker. And there was a kerfuffle about it, and a lot of very smart people got into some very heated arguments that were posted online, very much like what happens at Net Benefits, and except like valuable and good to read. But basically, the end result of that was that because that discussion had happened, then there was a far better understanding then of the intersectionality of like the queer women, like how that is, like what is that story, what are those narratives, and as a result, like there's been a lot more progress at a policy level because you've got the vested power structure of some very intelligent people who work like in huge universities that are very well known, and now with that Big Tent, you're able to use that political capital essentially to make positive change happen.
Brent, what's up?
I would say if you're running a K app and then the negative comes up and says you are the monolith, you're not intersectional. There are plenty of authors who say intersectionality is like a good place to start, but it's about interactions. And most young debaters get that confused with the oppression Olympics. It's not.
Yeah.
These authors are very explicit in saying there is not one form of oppression that is more morally reprehensible than another, but they argue that there are certain forms of oppression that inform how we view other ones. And so I've heard authors say, like, this nation was not built on animal cruelty. As bad as animal cruelty is, it's not better or worse than any other form of oppression. We just didn't do that. It was built on slavery.
Yeah.
And so people who talk about race, especially against Marxist, like Orthodox Marxism, it is, no, like, look at that. There's this book called Environmental Inequalities. It's very good against Orthodox Marxism. It's about Gary, Indiana. So it's interactions, not intersections, and that's one way to get out of the chaos.
That's a phrase that y'all might not have heard if you're newer to the activity, is oppression Olympics. That's a pretty important concept for the K in the sense that like your argument can always be that what the K is doing is basically forcing that debate, right? You're forcing us to have debates about the primacy of one narrative over another. So by asking these questions, you're saying like, great, like now we get to have the debate of who's more important and what's more valuable, and inevitably whoever the winner is, the loser is just gone. Like those voices are now lost, and that discourse is gone forever. So,
But remember,
that also
if someone
ties
says that, your response, not our argument.
not our argument.
Yeah.
So is intersectionality like they all inform each other at
Yeah.
once, and interaction is there's a pecking order of what informs what?
Interaction is actually just interaction, like it's people talking, and like it's so like the conflation that Brandon is talking about is when people make the argument about like, well, you're not being intersectional because you're not referencing these voices. What's important is that those voices all then talk to each other as opposed to bifurcating, right?
Is that the argument?
It was a debate panel held at the UC Irvine conference. The article name is Ghetto Kids Gone Good, and it's published by Shania Brinkley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shannara.
Yeah.
Shannara Reed Brinkley.
Yeah, Reed Brinkley, and it's basically her argument about like, look, it's not, they interact, race and gender, and race and class and gender interact. It's just that there are focal points sometimes. And then, again, debate is always about in this instance. In this instance, like talking generalities in debate is better. In this instance, this interacts more. We start here, it's a better start. It's the little things that like, you guys talked about.
That's a name, by the way, that you should definitely familiarize yourself to get up on like K-Debate. Shannara is, she's amazing. She's coached a lot of really fantastic teams for like at historically black colleges, and she was also at Pittsburgh. She's a genius.
I think one thing too is that going back to the point about sort of in this instance, I think that on certain types of topics, particularly topics dealing with either particular, if your app is going to be about some particular oppressed group in some foreign country, or if you're going to make arguments about the U.S., you can often make arguments that it's important to talk about race in those contexts because there's a historical specificity to racism in those contexts that these sort of abstract discussions of class and gender just don't account for, right? Like, if you read arguments about race in the United States, you can say, well, talking about capitalism in the abstract is important. There's no way to have a discussion about what capitalism has done in the United States without talking about the way in which capitalism instantiated the system of slavery, right? People owned other people. And I think you can make those sorts of arguments, talk about the historical specificity of your affirmative, and the arguments that you are making as reasons why you should prefer that sort of analysis versus sort of the general theorizing. Okay. Yeah.
So, like, and again, I've been out of activity for like a year, right? So, but my whole thing is like, when I was there, it's not like people ran hyper-specific shit all the time, right? Like, so, like, a lot of these, and that was my thing, is like, I think it is definitely getting way more specific. But like, I mean, is there any particular like things that like you as critics find way more persuasive or a way to kind of say that? As in, like, you are not as specific as you need to be, that is more offensive. Because generally saying, like, you're not specific is not really an argument.
Well, historicity would be the word that I would use. Like, and I like when people talk about the way that the background, the historical background of things. Like, you don't want to just say, obviously, like, oh, this is not specific. Like, you want to tell the story. It's worth spending the time on.
And it's not, saying you're not specific enough is a defensive argument.
Right.
Saying that in comparison to our affirmative, you are not specific, and that our affirmative is a more specific way of thinking about, of theorizing, of addressing this problem, that is an offensive argument. And that fundamentally, that all you're trying to do in these K debates is set yourself up whereby you can leverage the affirmative to say that our affirmative is a better explanation of the problem you diagnosed in the K, that our affirmative solves it better, that we made arguments about why policymaking, either in general or in this specific instance, is important to address whatever problem you approached in the K. And all of those arguments are just, they go back to the fundamental point, which is that your affirmative is what you would use to beat the K. It's not a bunch of random arguments you deploy in the MG, it's how you operationalize your affirmative.
One thing also, so another strategy that a lot of people use against the alternative is the counter critique. I am here to tell you, as like to proselytize to all of you, that that is a bad strategy. Like, do not waste your time. If you are spending time writing out a counter critique, basically you're just, like, there's no reason to build more structure that now gives them more offense, because that's going to be like your argument against the K, and there's no reason why you would ever wanna make it an actual structured thing. Just make those arguments on the link or the alternative level. Like, there's no reason to create a new independent vehicle for disaster that then they can like attach all kinds of links to, and then they can perm that, or all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I also think that both is just an organizational principle, and also maybe it's an argumentative principle as well, is I think that if you're affirmative, you should always be thinking and framing your arguments in terms of disadvantage of the alternative.
Oh yeah, so that was the one thing that we wanted to talk about. Smitty and I both have very similar views of how a critique is, like what they all fundamentally are. A lot of you have probably heard that every single critique is a non-unique disadvantage. And Smitty and I were talking earlier, and he's right, that the alternative is basically there in a critique to provide uniqueness. So getting rid of the alternative is super specific, or super strategic then in that regard, because if you get rid of the alternative, boom, there's no uniqueness to the critique. And while just saying the critique is non-unique is going to have every judge raising their eyebrows, explaining why that then ties into like inevitability arguments is a very good way of making the whole thing go away like some bad hippie nightmare.
And I also think that on this point, this is where some of the most effective, I don't think that framework arguments are usually the best theoretical response to a K, but occasionally there are certain theory arguments you can make in the alternative where, you know, if somebody says, well, you know.
Like A-spec.
Not A-spec. But no, like, I mean, a lot of, you know, if you have some alternative that's like, oh, you know, vote neg so we can all hold hands and say kumbaya and reflect about how bad capitalism has been in our lives. I mean, you know, that fundamentally, it may be, you know, it might be artificially competitive, it might be object fiat, it might be a lot of things where basically they're functionally just saying, well, you know, it's capitalism and capitalism is bad, so our alternative is going to be to wave our magic wand and no more capitalism, ta-da!
Yeah, it's really cool how that never works.
And there are decent theoretical reasons that that is not okay, especially for instance if you get, you know, a alternative that's just like, well, just vote negative, reject capitalism. It's like that's functionally a ban the plan counter plan, which is illegitimate because it's just totally artificially competitive. It's not a real competing policy option. It's just here are all the bad things, and the counter plan is not to do any of the bad things. It's not.
Yeah, and like I think the argument here that when you make theory arguments on a critique against an alternative specifically, you definitely don't want to make like the voter arguments you would normally do is that this is like the gateway issue, this is the thing that comes first, this precludes the entirety of their speech act. You definitely don't want to do that because the classic K response is again just to tie, oh, this is another link, this is another link, oh, look how much you've linked. Like, okay, we agree, that's fine. You don't want to make it that way. You do want to tie them into the value of the activity, right? Like the education that you're getting. It's always about critical education, and anytime that you can get, you can weigh that in substantive terms against a critique without having to make it like a stupid a priori like procedural shell. You can make arguments that the education that you would have received had they not basically run their ban, the plan, counter plan, it would be X, like it would be this good, we'd be talking about this, we've already had this discussion, this has been very valuable, we've learned about this, and we can use that later to make this
No, I
change.
mean, I think those are fair arguments. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with those sort of theory arguments. I think it's fine to say that it is unfair for you to, you know, wave a magic wand and get rid of capitalism. You can say that's not an okay thing to make, that grabs out your ability to, among other things, to leverage your affirmative, which is already stolen your 20 minutes of prep time and your 7 minutes of the after. Right? And that's probably unfair. You can also, I think, make arguments that that people's alternatives, that theoretical problems to alternatives are also reasons why their alt doesn't solve. For instance, the classic example of this is if you ever read an alternative vagueness argument, that alternative vagueness is not just a reason why their alternative is a moving target that you can't generate offense against, but it's also a reason that because nobody knows what the alternative is, it means that the alternative will be politically unproductive, it won't solve, it will be co-opted.
Yes. You definitely always want to tie back into that, like how the alt fails itself. And there's a lot of really good reasons why that's true. Like, for example, like you can go back to, I mean, there's also empirical examples, like any amount of, talk about the Green Party as much as you want. That's a pretty solid example of how very like-minded, smart people get together and then don't change anything. I mean, Ralph Nader made seatbelts in cars. That was cool.
Right, and again, I mean, not only did they not change anything, I mean.
They made it harder for other people
Yeah, I mean-
then to leverage like their unique viewpoints against. this
Well, I
system.
mean, in more concrete terms, I mean, there's pretty good political science literature that Ralph Nader probably cost Al Gore the election in 2000.
Oh, yeah,
Which is an empirical example of how the splitting of, left-wing groups rather than a coalition-building strategy to unite around one moderate leader.
Oh yeah, it's funny. I actually wrote my thesis on that. So my thesis was based on the failure of Democratic Party politics, and this ties into like the big tent, small tent theory in terms of the alternative. And what I was able to isolate, thanks to a book by Marcus Melitzis, who writes the Daily Post blog. It's called Crashing the Gate. It's basically that the reason why the Democratic Party had so much trouble so long was because they are basically beholden then to all of these single issue interest groups. It's people that have their one goal that come into the party and they're like, yo, we need to get attention to this, but we're not gonna listen to anybody else. The prime example in the real world about this, there was a senator in Rhode Island, Lincoln Chafee, and he was a Democrat, or what was it, his challenger, he was a Democrat, but he didn't like Roe v. Wade. So like he was against abortion completely, 100% against it. But on everything else, he's like a Democrat. And then the challenger was a guy who was a Republican and very much Republican, but oddly enough was a fan of Roe v. Wade. So what ended up happening is the endorsement from the NARAL came out and definitely affected hundreds of thousands of votes. And what happened was the Republican ended up winning because he was pro. Which the problem there then is you've got a guy like Lincoln Chafee would go in and he would be by the minority whip basically browbeaten into voting party politics all the way through on everything. And his one personal stance on this issue would not be germane to anything that would make changes in this country. The other guy, however, is a piece of crap who's gonna vote like to cut education funding, he's gonna make more tax cuts, and he did that. He went on to do all of these things and had no legitimate political voice on the Roe v. Wade issue anyway, because the Republican Party doesn't give a crap about that. So this is a real world example of when, keeping it real goes wrong.
I also want to, I think there's a broader point that you can take from this story, which is that in terms of the literature that you can read to get good at beating the K, a lot of people think that in order to beat the K, you need to get really good at like philosophy and critical theory literature. I actually think you will be much better off if you get a really good grasp of like history. Science, a lot of classical social studies stuff, because I think that a lot of those genres give you some really good arguments against the K. To give you one example, in a lot of like international relations K debates, about whether realism is inevitable or not, you can't have those sorts of debates without having an understanding of sort of like how different schools have thought about IR work, about having a good understanding of how rational choice theory works, and about sort of what incentives are driving rational actors.
The history of oppressed peoples typically a very good resource in terms of learning about how to beat the K, because if you know the way that the government treated people to make that situation possible and the pushback that there was to try to affect change, you immediately know that none of what they were doing was working, and you can isolate why that didn't work and why the government or whoever the powers that be crapped all over these people, and that was just their story, right? So like if you can figure out from the past where things went wrong, then you can just look at the K and be like, doing it again, there you go, it's the same story.
So, as you've probably figured out over the last hour, this is not really a list of arguments that you can read against the K, so much just some sort of general tips for thinking about how to beat the K. And I mean, our hope is that you take some of these sort of general ideas and sort of turn them into more discrete arguments, and just that this will help you think about the K, especially when you see.
I mean, like we can write up like.
we have like 5 minutes left.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, but we can like basically like your K answers should be, you always want your framework, just to avoid spikes, get out of those. You want your link turn, preferably multiple, times 100. Then on the impact, you don't ever want to say no impact to a critique. You will get steamrolled if you say that.
probably a link.
It is definitely a link to say that there is no impact to an argument about like oppressed peoples. That's not a good idea. Like we're not even that dumb. But on the impact level, you can definitely say this is where you make your inevitability claims, and this is also where you make your root cause claims. And you definitely need to spend time on your root cause claims. On the alternative, things that you should always have: turn. You always want your turns. You always want your reasons, as many reasons as possible. Their alternative is bad or worse. Like if what they're doing perpetuates the same problems, blah, 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 blah. You also want, probably, you want your perm.
Well, that's all true about the alternative. I think in many of those, I mean, it's good to have a variety of arguments for the whole.
Yeah.
I think that fundamentally, the single most important argument that you can make in the K debate, single most important, I think by a long shot, is that the criticism does not solve the 1AC.
Nope. If it doesn't solve the 1AC, that means this goes away, the alt goes away, there's no uniqueness for the K, no uniqueness for the K, proves your inevitability claims, goodbye critique, and now you can whip around.
We have like a few minutes left. Questions?
Yeah, if there's anything anybody has they wanna.
It seems like a lot of these answers imply some kind of critique that's trying to rescue marginalized voices or help oppressed people. That if it's a more radical criticism, Nietzsche, or something that's really, you know, an attack on all subjectivity or all value, that you want to shy away from sort of coalitional politics or.
Oh yeah, I mean these are obviously not answers to a K like Nietzsche. I think that
This is not the NATO politics answers.
I think that against those sorts of Ks, I mean my favorite strategy is just to combine your policy-making good type arguments with arguments that are sort of a defense of the Enlightenment. Like rationality is good, science is good, assigning value to things is good, and just making those arguments that our affirmative is not just some abstract discussion of what the USFG should do, but our affirmative is a commitment to a particular ethical way of living that envisions government as a tool that can solve problems in people's lives and that can mobilize science and rationality.
Also, one last thing, critique is always basically a binary claim, right? Like there's a right, wrong. The critique espouses ideological purity in what it says. As long as you know that what the critique is doing is basically positing one framework of beliefs over yours, that's where you can start to leverage. You get a ton off.
That's sometimes true.
Yeah.
There are certainly critiques, especially things that are sort of in the identity politics genre or cap, that you can make all the arguments that like, well, the way in which you have operationalized and talked about this argument is functionally, one step removed from Maoism. And you can make those types of arguments. But sometimes, people will make arguments on the critique that actually your affirmative is doing that, because your affirmative is, saying there's only one right answer. Your affirmative embraces a particular view of rationality or a particular view of science or a particular view of human existence, and that's what's totalizing that. In that case, you can't do that. You can do the opposite.
But,
as critics, how persuaded are you by purported contradiction arguments, like you link to your own K?
The link to your own K is an argument that you need on every critique that you debate. You always need that, but you don't necessarily want to label. That's not a performative contradiction as much as it is just like they perpetuate the same nonsense. Like link to themselves, you want multiple reasons as to why they do that. Performative contradiction in terms of persuasiveness as a critic, like if you can make it offensive, I guess, like and show me why that's bad. There's a lot of really good arguments as to why percon is very good. Schlag 91, classic.
I think that's right. Fundamentally, with PerfCon, as with any other argument, you need an impact. And if you're just like, performance contradiction, you contradict yourself, you lose. I'm like, why?
They cancel out. It's like, ow, why would that be true?